Hi guys, how's everyone doing? Good, awesome. So I'd like to introduce you to Rizwan. Rizwan is the founder of Gameview Studios that actually sold about a year ago to DeNA Labs. So that's how most of the world knows him. What you don't know about him is that he's also a well-known fish dealer, and he's been interviewed by The Daily Show. And in a few weeks, you're going to see exactly how he made a big fish dealing business. Joke, his game is Tapfish.
Yeah, they'll be on in a couple of weeks on the Daily Show. So they came out, they were looking for somebody who was doing virtual goods sales, which they likened to dealing drugs, which should be kind of interesting. So it should be fun.
All right, so keep your eyes peeled for that. So with that, some questions, Riz. How hard can I be?
As hard as you like, I guess.
All right, okay. So what type of games does Gameview do? And what do you stand for? What makes you guys different?
So we started Gameview about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now, and we make mobile social games. Our best known game was a game called Tapfish, which had something like 10 to 20 million downloads on iOS, and is now 10 to 20 million downloads on Android, or getting close to that. And we're currently the number one top grossing game in the Google Android market at the moment, which we're pretty happy about. But so we have a series of games. Another game is called Tap Ranch, which is a type of farming game. We have a game called Tap Town, which is a city building game. You'll notice the consistency there between the tabs, yeah. And so all of our games basically are what we call resource management games. Some of you may know them as similar to some of the genres on Facebook that Zynga and others are known for. But basically the player has to arrange a certain number of resources. They have a limited set of resources. They have to arrange them, then they go away, and then they come back and see what happened to those resources. So in the case of Tap Fish, you have to buy little fish eggs, and you hash the eggs, and you have to come back every so often to feed the fish, and if you don't, the fish will die. So that's the basic...
That's how you deal fish and make your money?
That's right, and
awesome.
the first fish is free. The fish hook, that's right.
So, Android games, from taps to Android, the tapping mechanic onto a different mechanic for Android. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done there?
Yeah, so we started as a iOS-only game company, so all of our games were, through the iTunes Apple Store. That was a fun process. And so about a year ago, we were contemplating whether to port our games to Android, and we had a big debate internally, right? And half the guys were like, hey, Android's the future, you gotta put your games to Android. And the other half of our company was like, you can't make any money on Android, so it's a complete waste of time and money to port our games over to Android. So what we did was we had a small skunkworks project that started porting Tapfish over to Android well before a lot of our competitors did. And so we released Tapfish on Android in April of this year. And that actually worked out pretty well. The game started to be pretty popular, became the number one casual game for quite a long time. And then when we released, Google's in-app purchases were there, but they were still kind of getting there. So they were present, but they weren't quite there. And over time, it seems like they've improved that process as well. So now we're seeing actually pretty good monetization on Android. I mean, I've heard from some mobile game developers that Android games monetize at like 1/10 of what their iOS counterparts do. We haven't seen that. I mean, for us, in fact, this month will be the first month where we actually make more money on Android than on iOS.
Awesome getting there. But about the game mechanic, did you have to change the game a lot in moving from an iOS game to Android?
We didn't have to change it too much. I mean, there were a few things that we modified. I mean, so the screen sizes are fairly similar, right? There's some differences here and there. I mean, one of the problems with Android is you have so many different handsets, and so you have to do a lot more QA. You have lower-end devices that have a lot less memory than some of the higher-end devices, so that was a bit of a pain. And so it took us a while, and at some point you just kind of...
How much time on Q&A?
I mean, many months of Q&A. So typically with an iPhone game, once we build it, we would release it. Once we get to feature complete within 3 or 4 weeks, we're able to do enough QA to get it out. But with Android, it just takes longer because you have so many different handsets and things to try. And at some point, you just kind of have to say, okay, we're not going to support certain low-end devices, or we're only going to support from a certain version of the operating system, et cetera. Otherwise, you'll just drive yourself crazy just from a QA perspective.
Was there any clear delineation in terms of like, hey, which devices had more of the market share that helped you with that decision?
Yeah, I mean, we just went to like the top 5 or 6 at the time and said, okay, we're going to make sure it works on the top 5 or 6 devices, and everything underneath that, we're hoping it, we were hoping it would work on, and it worked on most of them. But some of the lower end devices, we've had issues.
And the QA was internal to you guys? Or
Yeah, in our case,
outside firms?
It was primarily internal. So we have an office in Mountain View. And then we have an offshore team in Pakistan that's actually part of Gameview, so it's our own team, which my brother runs out there.
At some other point, we'll do a talk about exiting a company that actually is not in the U.S.
Yeah, there's lots of complications there, definitely. So we did it all internally ourselves, but I mean, there are lots of firms out there that could help you with testing, on different devices. And then there's also Device Anywhere, which I don't know if many of you have used that. But, what's that?
What was the question? Didn't catch it, but maybe at Q&A you can ask that again. And so where are things in general going with Android? What do you see as happening?
Well, so, I mean, we're all aware of the number of handsets, right, for Android that are being activated, something like 550,000 per day, right? And so, I'll answer from the perspective of a game developer, right? So, we see Android as pretty significant, in moving forward. We're still splitting our time between iOS and Android. But if you were to start a company from scratch, I think it's no longer clear. 6 months ago, or even a year ago, it would have been pretty clear that if you were starting a game company, you'd probably want to start on iOS first because that's where the monetizing users were. If you wanted your game to make some money, but today I think it's a toss-up. You could start on either, and we'll talk, I guess, a bit about some of the cross-platform development environments. But
which brings me to my next question. If we were to start a new Android game from scratch today, would you use a cross-platform engine? And what do you think about cross-platform engines in general?
Well, again, going back to when we were doing our first Android game, we ended up writing it natively, just like we wrote our first iOS game using Objective-C, and we used Java on the Android side. And so over the last 6 months, we've started working with a cross-platform development environment, so DeNA, the company that acquired us, right, also acquired a company called NGMoko, which is right down, there we go, and it's right down the road here. And so they've just released the Mobage platform, which is a combination of a mobile social network for gamers and a cross-platform development environment. So they have a JavaScript-based development environment that if you write it once, you can run it on Android and you can release it on iOS as well. So we've been doing a lot with that. And to be perfectly honest, we were pretty skeptical about the whole idea because we do games and performance is an issue. And so, when we did our original games, that's why we did them natively. But the platform has come along. So we have a game called Tap Town that we built on top of this platform, written in JavaScript, on top of NG Core Mobile. And it's out in the Android market. And we're now about to release the iOS version of that game built on top of the same platform. So it's the same code base. So I think in a couple of weeks or within a month, they'll do a formal launch of the iOS side. So DeNA has done a launch of Mobage and its cross-platform development environment on Android already. And you'll see there's a number of games out there now like Zombie Farm, Pocket Frogs, Our Games, and a bunch of other games that are on the Mobage platform that are being released in the Android market.
Now, I know this might be different for you, but if any of these guys were to go and build on Mobage, there's a rev share, right?
Yeah, so DeNA and NGMoko, there's a rev share. So Mobage, I mean, a lot of people in the US probably aren't familiar with Mobage. In Japan, it's a fairly big, well-known brand. It's kind of like Coke or Pepsi, right? They'll do like commercials on TV, so people will know it as a consumer brand. And so what's starting to happen here is as DeNA will start to spend quite a bit on marketing, you'll start to see more and more mentions of Mobage. You may even see at some point some TV commercials like they have in Japan. And so there'll be a pretty large user base on Mobage. And what's happening with both iOS and Android is there's so many apps in the App Store, how do you get your app noticed above sort of the fray? And so what Mobage provides is kind of a protected environment where there's only so many apps within that environment. So if you can get one of those apps, you'll get a chunk of the large user base that DeNA and Mobage is investing in.
And cross-promoting to your games.
Yeah, and then cross-promoting to the games as well, absolutely.
So, marketing spend, did you spend anything at all outside of Mobage to get some installs into these games, the ones on Android?
Yeah, so again, we started without Mobage, so we started just native Android games. And our first game on Android, like I said, was Tapfish. We actually did not spend a lot of money. So we were kind of surprised. It was like an experiment for us. We said, hey, let's try this on Android. And we started to get some installs, and we were pretty low in the ranking, and we started to get some more installs, and we started to see the ratings were really good. And the next thing you know, we were in the top 50 in casual, and then we were in the top 50 total. So it's actually kind of interesting that we didn't spend a lot of money to get to where we were with our first game. Now, our second game on Android was Tap Ranch, and for that, we had to spend a lot of money. So this shows you that...
a lot of money.
Well, actually, it wasn't that much money, because we had such a large user base on Tapfish that we were able to cross-promote over. But it was interesting, for our first game, we didn't have a large user base. We had 0 on Android, yet it grew pretty much organically. And then for the second game, we had to cross-promote over to it, and we're spending money, but not as much as we do on the iOS side. It's not clear yet exactly what the ranking algorithm is in the Android market. We've heard lots of theories that, in the iOS side, it's primarily based on velocity of downloads over some time period. So if you want to be the number, the top 25 downloaded apps, you have to have something like 60,000 downloads across a couple of days, or some numbers close to that. In the Android market, it's not really clear what percentage of the algorithm is based on the number of downloads, and what percentage is based on things like ratings. We've heard theories that uninstall matters, like your uninstall rate. So things like incented installs may or may not work as well on Android. So
can you talk about the spend at all for your second game? And what channels you spend?
So we use companies like Tapjoy and Flurry, both as a publisher to make money from incented installs. How many of you guys are familiar with Tapjoy or incented installs? Okay, quite a few, but not that many. So basically the idea is you give the user something for free in exchange for them taking an action. So normally in our game, we have a virtual currency called Fishbucks, and you can buy, for 99 cents, you can buy 25 Fishbucks. For $1.99, you can buy 55 Fishbucks, etc. Or you can install other apps through networks like Tapjoy, and the advertiser, the guy who makes those other apps, will pay Tapjoy, who will pay us, and the user will get his Fishbucks for free. I don't know if that made sense. But
Got it, everyone? Yes, I think folks are pretty familiar with that.
Yeah.
And so a combination
we end up spending on that. We've tried some banner ads.
What was the ad payout for you, the conversion from banner ads to actual installs?
It hasn't been that great. So we haven't found banner ads to be a great mechanism. It turns out to be fairly expensive. But what's happening is that in general, the cost per install is rising. So even though banner ads were kind of expensive a couple months ago, now they're looking normal in terms of where it works out to. So it's changing a bit.
So one question, is Mobage an engine only or some kind of a social glue in your mind?
Okay, it's actually both. So Mobage in Japan started as a social network where every player had an avatar on their mobile phones, and they were chatting with other avatars. And then later they added social games on top of that platform so that you could play with your friends, play against your friends, etc. So on the smartphone space, it's the same concept. So you have a Mobage ID, and you have your Mobage friends whom you can play with. You can share items within the games. You can visit their tanks, for example, in Tapfish, or other games. And so it's like a mobile social network of people playing games. And it's a cross-platform development environment. So it's kind of both of those things wrapped in one.
Awesome. So anything else that you want to add about Android development that you think we did not touch, which is important for people just starting off or finding out?
I would say that Android development is pretty promising right now. I think the process itself can be painful, but I do think some of these cross-platform development environments are now getting to the point where the performance is pretty good across both iOS and Android. And so if I was starting from scratch, I would definitely consider using one of these, potentially looking at HTML. We haven't done a lot with HTML5 yet, and so we're kind of waiting and seeing. We're a bit skeptical in general when something new comes out, so we like to kind of wait to see how things go. We were that way with Android, right? Although we did jump in relatively early. Even with our own company, DeNA acquired us, we were still a bit skeptical at first, but then we started to see...
About the acquisition?
And not about the acquisition, but about the development environment, until we started to see that it was actually working. And so then we went ahead with it. And so, that's what we like to do, is we like to try things out first, see how they go before we jump in. Because that's a pretty big commitment, right? If you choose a platform or an environment, you're pretty much on that platform or environment. And so you want to make sure you've done some prototyping and then that it can do what you need it to do. And I believe the platforms, including DNAs, are now there that you can build really good games on top of these platforms.